Population and racism. There was a time when people thought that the population issue should be addressed in a forceful fashion. For example, China's one-child policy, which began in the late 1970s on the heels of a well-established two-child policy, was probably the most extreme form of population planning ever implemented by any state. The Chinese government required contraception use, sterilization, and abortions, as well as levied extraordinary fines for violators, and by that I mean couples who had more than one child. As you might expect, this program was a disaster. We now know that if you educate girls and women and give them access to contraception, and by that I mean access to cost-free contraception, is enough. There's no need to require its use. The birth rate will dramatically decline. Although, ideally, men should also take responsibility here, as they, too, can obviously use contraception. Giving women reproductive control over their own body has proven to be the most effective course of action. What I find so interesting about this approach to curbing greenhouse gas emissions is that it is a win-win-win. First, rolling back gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions is obviously terrific. Second, educating women and girls across the planet is also great in its own right. Even without the environmental gains, we should obviously, make every effort to do this. And third, as far as I'm concerned, speaking in part as the father of a daughter, every woman on the planet should have control, including reproductive control of her own body. This is not to say that implementing these cultural changes would be easy. It's arguably far easier to make major technological leaps, such as by making automobiles electric, than to change people's actions. Indeed, if you think about it for even a minute, it's probably already obvious that we have stepped into a cultural quagmire here. Birth control is a hot issue across the planet, not only in the U.S. In Latin America and the Caribbean, for example, 97% of women do not have unrestricted access to abortion as an option of last resort. And this is true in many parts of the world. While it might seem that educating girls and women would be less controversial than birth control, let's not forget that we have a Nobel laureate, and that's Malala Yousaf, who in part, because she dared to suggest that girls in Pakistan should be educated, was the subject of a nearly successful assassination attempt. Even when not violently protested, education of girls and women is a low priority, and often a very low priority across the planet. And there is another problem. In the U.S. and other parts of the wealthy world, people who have advocated for a smaller global population have sometimes been racist, even if maybe unknowingly. This is an ugly aspect of the situation which we need to spend a little time. If, over the past 50 years, you regularly ask the average American on the street to list their top environmental concerns, there is one particular that would have likely repeatedly heard over the years: population. This anxiety was in part fueled by an enormously influential book from 1968, The Population Bomb by Paul and Ann Ehrlich, which predicted that an exploding human population would soon be disastrous for our species and the planet. The interesting thing was that the U.S. population was not exploding over this time, not by a long shot. In fact, the U.S. birth rate has steadily been declining over recent decades. After hitting an all-time high of 18.4% of women in 1970, the birth rate has declined to 11.8% in 2017. We are now below the replacement rate of 2.1 births per woman, which means that over time the population of the U.S. would, if no other factors were in play, ultimately begin to decline. Hardly a population bomb. In fact, the birth rate is so low now that we might rightly be concerned about an economic slowdown. Except, fortunately, that immigration to the U.S. is sustaining our population. So why have so many Americans been made anxious by the notion of a population bomb? If asked, and if they answered honestly, some Americans would likely have made clear that their anxiety didn't principally have to do with the U.S. at all, but rather with places like India, China, and Africa. Across the continent of Africa and its nearly 50 plus countries, women have far more than 2.1 children. In fact, on average, they have 4.7. If current trends continue, Africa's population will double by 2050. By 2100, a third of all people on Earth may live in Africa. So, there you have it. In the minds of many Americans, this particular population bomb is the number one environmental problem that we are currently facing. But let's look at this issue with specific reference to the climate crisis and from the other side of the table, from the point of view of the poorest people on the planet. Incidentally, in 2019, 70% of the poorest of all people on Earth lived in Africa. As I've noticed in previous segments, the poorest 3 billion people on Earth have contributed a paltry 5% of all human-emitted greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. In contrast, Americans have dumped a staggering 25% of those gases into the atmosphere, even though we constitute just 4% of the world's population. Every year, the average American is currently responsible for 6.5 metric tons of CO2 or equivalent gases being emitted into the atmosphere. Staggering. The average person in sub-Saharan Africa emits just 0.8 tons, less than 1/20th the amount. Consequently, if you ask the average person on the street in any country in sub-Saharan Africa to list their top environmental concerns, we should not at all be surprised if they replied that they were made very anxious by wealthy countries like the United States and are unchecked emitting of greenhouse gases. From their perspective, the very idea that we in the wealthy world would blame them for our current environmental predicament, especially with respect to the climate crisis to which they did little to contribute, may well seem outright ridiculous. And let's be honest, that they would be right. It is ridiculous. However, it could be objected that perhaps there are other environmental issues not directly related to the climate crisis that come into play here. For example, more people need more food and water. That's just simple math. Actually, the math isn't that simple. The average American eats 5 or 6 times more meat every year than the average African. Since it can take 10 or more pounds of edible plants to make 1 pound of meat, and an incredible 1,800 gallons of water goes into producing a pound of beef, you could easily feed 5, 6, or more people in Africa with the same amount of resources that it takes to feed a single American. And there are currently fewer than 4 Africans for every American citizen. Americans are, in effect, eating and drinking far, far more than all of the countries of sub-Saharan Africa combined. So, what's really at the root of this concern over this particular population bomb? There could be a number of things. Perhaps some of the people who hold this view simply do not know the facts that we have been reviewing. Fair enough. However, let's just be honest and say it. Racism plays a role here, especially if the same individuals are made anxious by the fact that the U.S. birth rate is higher for people of color than white. Most of us have seen the frightening images that came out of Charlottesville, Virginia in August of 2007 and heard the chant, quote, "You will not replace us." As the Anti-Defamation League notes, this chant, quote, follows in the footsteps of the best-known white supremacist motto, "We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children," otherwise known as the 14 words. The term reflects the primary white supremacist worldview that unless immediate action is taken, the white race is doomed to extinction by an alleged rising tide of color, close quote. I am, of course, not saying that everyone who is concerned about the planet's swelling population is a racist. However, when Americans suggest that the global population is the root problem of climate change and look to places like Africa or India as examples, it's simply wrong. Incidentally, in India, the per capita CO2 emissions are less than 1/10 of the U.S. So, should we simply forget about population when it comes to climate change? Absolutely not. We definitely need to stabilize and ultimately reduce the human population of this planet. However, as I previously noted, greenhouse gas emissions should always be thought of as a ratio of emissions to population. In other words, we cannot just focus on how many people there are on the earth. We also need to consider how many resources each of them consumes and the corresponding emissions. Focusing on population without taking into account consumption and hence emissions is simply misguided and can even be racist.